Everyone thought the Hackman family would mourn in private, maybe make a short statement and then disappear from public view, but what happened next was unbelievable. Rumors turned into accusations, and then there was a courtroom bombshell that changed everything. Join us as we reveal Christopher Hackman's shocking confession about his father's death. Reports say Christopher said his father's death could have been caused by a gas leak. As unbelievable as that sounds, there were different ways to look at what he said. At first, Christopher's explanation for what happened to his father made sense. Gene's house was old and hidden away in a charming but old part of Santa Fe, which is known for its classic architecture and old infrastructure. A gas leak wasn't impossible. But Christopher's words did more than just make people worry about the safety of the building. They caused a chain of doubts that no one saw coming. They also raised questions like why he brought up a gas leak at this time, and more importantly, what was he really trying to say? It wasn't long before reporters started digging, and what they found broke the perfect image of a father and son united by love and respect. Instead, they found a web of contradictions, buried secrets, and long-standing tensions. Christopher Hackman had always been a strange person. Unlike other famous kids, he never sought fame or attention. For years, people thought that his silence was a sign of respect for his father's legacy, or an early sign of something deeper and more complicated. Less than 4 months after Gene Hackman's death, the courtroom doors opened and the story took a dramatic turn. It wasn't just about how Gene had died. Well, I like that. I like to think of myself as a craftsman who must do certain things. This revelation about what Christopher did in the weeks and months before his father died sounds a little fishy. If you want to know why, keep watching as we reveal some shocking facts about Gene's death and Christopher's hidden actions. As time went on, claims surfaced that he had tried to change his father's will, and rumors spread that he had lied to his father. Christopher told the public about Gene's health, which was shocking, and Christopher himself admitted that he hadn't been completely honest. The case quickly grew into more than just a family dispute. It became a national conversation about loyalty, inheritance, and the thin line between protection and deception. Gene Hackman was more than just an actor. He was a legend. He left Hollywood on his own terms, choosing privacy over attention, but after he died, his carefully guarded silence was drowned out by endless speculation. Prosecutors focused on Gene Hackman's last 6 months of life, saying that Christopher had been quietly planning changes to his father's will during this time. They showed proof that he had lied to lawyers, saying that Gene Hackman was mentally unstable, while secretly recording happy times in photos and messages, and showing emails, calendar notes, and financial records that all pointed to a well-thought-out plan. But it wasn't just the hard evidence that made people suspicious. It was the feeling of what people thought would be a peaceful death slowly falling apart. Then, during a crucial part of the trial, Christopher made a confession that changed everything. His words were measured and heavy. He didn't cry right away, but something inside him seemed to change. Christopher Hackman had decided to protect his father's legacy, even if it meant telling lies in court. Some people in the courtroom couldn't hold back tears, while others looked away, not sure how to feel. Was Christopher a devoted son trying to do the right thing, or had he used his father's illness for personal gain? No one knew the answer, which made the case even more interesting. The media jumped right into the emotional twist, with headlines calling Christopher a heartbroken son and others calling him dishonest. At one minute he was seen as a man who had to make an impossible choice, and the next he was accused of betrayal. When the verdict came in, Christopher wasn't charged with a crime, but his reputation would never be the same. For every person who felt sorry for him, there was someone who felt sorry for the actor. What made this case so powerful wasn't just the fact that it involved a famous actor or that it played out so dramatically in court. It was the deeper, more personal struggles that were brought to light. As Christopher watched a loved one die, millions of people could relate to parts of his story. He had to deal with the painful reality of their illness and the impossible choice between honesty and loyalty. These stories made people question Christopher's choices, but this was just the beginning. What began as a personal family tragedy became a national conversation that was talked about in courtrooms, broken down in homes, and analyzed in news reports and documentaries. But before all of this, one thing that Christopher Hackman was known for before the scandal and the courtroom drama was being the son of a famous Hollywood actor. But despite having a famous last name, Christopher never used it to his advantage. He never did interviews about his father, never went on talk shows to talk about Gene's success, and never tried to cash in on Hollywood nostalgia. In fact, he seemed to go out of his way to avoid the spotlight, which many people admired because it made him stand out from other famous children. He wasn't interested in fame or attention, but that quiet nature would work against him in the years to come. His silence, which was once seen as humility, would start to look like secrecy. But is he really being honest, or is it all a show? Let's look at Christopher's early years. Christopher joined Gene Hackman's story in 1960 when Gene was still trying to get major roles. Christopher grew up in a world of uncertainty. His father hadn't won any awards or become a household name. As with many families trying to get ahead, the Hackman family lived in small apartments in New York and then Los Angeles. They had to deal with financial stress, long work hours, and the difficulties of balancing work and family life. By the time Gene's career took off in the 1970s, Christopher was already a teenager. Suddenly, his father wasn't just an actor, he was a superstar, and not just any celebrity. He was known for taking on bold roles and playing complex characters that left audiences speechless. But with success came responsibility. Gene seemed to spend less time with his son Christopher as he became more famous. Christopher's childhood friends remembered him as a quiet, artistic boy who kept to himself. He never bragged about his father, never invited friends to movie sets, and seemed uncomfortable with the attention that came with his last name. Still, there were no public scandals or nasty fallouts. Christopher didn't rebel against his father, write a tell-all book, or give exciting interviews to gossip magazines. He stayed out of trouble and worked. He worked behind the scenes in Hollywood for a while, learning how to use a camera and edit movies, but eventually he quit the business altogether. He was sometimes seen at film events or industry gatherings, but always in the background, never trying to get attention. His choice to stay private created a strong image. Everyone knows that some famous sons could have used their fame to make money, but Christopher didn't. He was a son who, unlike many children of Hollywood stars, didn't want to be famous, not interested in the fame and attention that came with it. His reputation earned him respect, until the day it didn't. In the last few years of Gene Hackman's life, the father and son were rarely seen together in public. By that time, Gene Hackman had retired and was living a quiet life in New Mexico, away from the chaos of Hollywood. To some, this distance might have meant that their relationship had ended, but family members said that Christopher was always there, setting up doctor's appointments and other things. As Gene's memory faded, Christopher did everything he could to keep his father out of the public eye, but in the end, it was this careful protection that caused the controversy. Did Christopher do what he did out of love, or was he using the situation for his own gain? That was the question that split the country and made people very worried. Christopher and his father had always been seen together in real, unstaged moments. They were captured in quiet moments. People thought their relationship was based on love and loyalty, because they talked a lot while taking walks in the sun or browsing bookshelves. Christopher was seen as the perfect son because he was quiet, reliable, and not affected by the chaos of Hollywood fame. While many celebrity families were known for scandals, he stood out by keeping his father's private life as private as he wanted, but when accusations against him came out, they shocked everyone. No one thought he would be at the center of a scandal, especially not the son who had worked so hard to protect his father's reputation in the beginning. There were no signs of anything fishy, but after his father died, Christopher seemed calm and collected, thanking people for their support and asking for privacy while the family grieved. That wasn't the end of it, though. He agreed to an interview with a local reporter, and it was that interview that revealed everything. Christopher made an educated gas leak might have played a part in his father's death. It caused a lot of people to raise their eyebrows. Why bring up something so serious without solid proof? Why hint at an environmental factor when official reports hadn't mentioned it? Was this just a slip of the tongue from a grieving son, or was there something more to it? No one knew what to think, but the authorities did. As they looked deeper into the last weeks of his father's life, disturbing details started to come to light. Medical records showed discrepancies in financial transactions that raised questions. Emails showed his father to be more aware and involved than Christopher had said. All of a sudden, the quiet and humble son's every statement, photograph, and action was closely looked at again. Was he really protecting his father's legacy, or was he trying to change the ending to fit his needs? The media, which had once been afraid to criticize the son of a politician, as the drama played out, experts debated the duties of adult children caring for aging parents, and psychologists talked about how hard it is to watch a loved one die. At the center of it all was Christopher, who was no longer in the background, but in the spotlight. Friends and family began sharing their own stories, and some described Christopher as a devoted son who had always struggled with living in the shadow of his famous father, but truly wanted to protect his parents. Others saw a different picture, one in which Christopher restricted access to his father so severely that even old friends were not allowed to see him. Was he protecting his father's peace, or was he keeping secrets? As the trial date got closer, it became clear that the case wasn't about whether Christopher loved his father. That wasn't in question anymore. The real question was whether he had been honest. The picture of the perfect, respectful son that Christopher had carefully kept up for decades was now part of the evidence being looked at. There were tough questions. Why did he say in court documents that his father was mentally incapable when he had just weeks earlier shared happy photos of the two of them together? Why has there been sudden suspicious activity in his father's bank accounts? Why was an attempt made to change his father's will right after he had a severe episode of disorientation? Christopher's answers were complicated. He talked about the stress of managing his father's declining health, trying to keep the family together, and keeping his father's public image as strong and in charge weighed heavily on his mind. He admitted to leaving out some details, but insisted he never meant to do anything wrong. Some believed him, while others didn't. His story didn't easily fit into the categories of hero or villain. Yes, he loved his father, and it hurt to see him get worse, but love doesn't always stop bad decisions, and pain doesn't always justify them. The public's view of Christopher's image was about to be broken piece by piece as the next chapter of his life began. He was no longer just the golden son. Instead, his story became more complicated and human, and people saw in him their own struggles with family, expectations, and the weight of doing what they thought was right. His fall from grace wasn't just a scandal. It was a deep reflection of how truth and perception don't always match up, and how even the best intentions can have terrible results. At first, Hackman's death was treated with the quiet respect that befits a Hollywood legend. At 95, he had long since retired from the public eye and spent his last years in the peaceful landscapes of Santa Fe. His death was acknowledged by family members and local officials, and no one thought to question it. After all, 95 is an age when death is normal. People nodded solemnly and said he had lived a full life and moved on. But that peace didn't last, because Christopher, in an interview with a small-town newspaper just 2 days after his father died, he casually mentioned that a possible gas leak might have contributed to his father's declining health. He even talked about strange smells in the house and strange behavior from his father in the weeks before his death. The reporter didn't press the issue, possibly out of respect, but that one comment shocked everyone. Within a day, entertainment blogs started writing about the theory. Major news outlets picked up the story, with some headlines being more cautious and others being much more dramatic. At first, it seemed like a simple misunderstanding, or maybe just a grieving son trying to find answers. But as local officials were put under pressure to give answers, the story began to fall apart. There had been no reports of a gas leak before or after Hackman's death, no emergency calls, no visits from the fire department, and most importantly, the autopsy that was quietly done a week after his death found nothing unusual. The natural cause of death was complications from Alzheimer's. There was no mention of environmental factors. So why had Christopher said otherwise? That was the question that was floating around. People close to the family started talking about it. Some said Hackman had been completely clear in their last conversations, while others remembered times when he seemed lost or confused. A former neighbor even brought it up. Several weeks before Hackman's death, 2 of his family's dogs were found wandering the streets, looking like they were confused. When asked if this could have been caused by the alleged gas leak, the neighbor said they didn't think so. But what really worried people were the people who had been in the house. An anonymous nurse who had cared for Hackman in his last days said he was still responsive just 3 days before he died, and another caretaker said he had moments of clarity and kept doing small tasks around the house. The house didn't match the story Christopher had told everyone. He had painted a picture of a man who was slowly losing his mind and wasn't aware of what was going on around him, but others had said that despite his illness, the man still had moments of strength and control. The contradictions were mounting. Christopher had always said that his father's mind was completely gone. He once sent a message to a friend saying that his father hadn't even recognized him for months. That message later became an important piece of evidence At first, no one believed what he said, but as the investigation went deeper, things didn't seem to add up. Carefully looked over medical reports painted a different picture. As more people became interested in the case, more questions were raised. Journalists started digging for the truth, asking for official medical files, statements, and anything else that could help clear things up. Then something unexpected was found. A very surprising detail hidden in a nurse's personal notes just 2 weeks before Hackman's death. A nurse recorded a conversation that completely contradicted Christopher's claims. According to the report, Hackman was talking about a rare personality disorder, the effects of past trauma, and even how emotional problems from his teenage years had shaped his life. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had lost touch with reality. Hackman even brought up his dependence on sedative drugs, which had never been brought up before. This made people wonder if Christopher was telling the truth, Christopher telling the whole story, or was he making up a version of events that would make the case more interesting for himself? The case didn't end with Christopher's statements. It went on to a courtroom drama, so stay tuned for some juicy details about that. If you know Gene well, you'll know that he was very careful, even when he was retired. His legacy was something he had carefully planned in his study. There were reports that there was a folder labeled "After It," which was like a new challenge. It was going out and trying to get that job and trying to contain handwritten notes, letters, and clear instructions on how he wanted to be remembered. His desire for privacy wasn't just about protecting his public image, it covered every aspect of his personal life. He had made specific requests for his funeral, listed the charities he had long supported, and even chosen the music he wanted to be played. Because of this careful planning, what happened after his death really surprised everyone. According to reports, his original will, which had been filed, it was very clear in Gene's will, which was officially filed and last updated 15 years before he died. It included large donations to charities, a trust fund for his grandchildren and close friends, and a carefully thought-out structure to make sure that no one person had too much control over his estate. His only son, Christopher, was named as the beneficiary and executive, but he didn't have too much power. When Christopher showed an updated will, it had been signed just 50 weeks before Gene's death. People were suspicious right away because the new document had been properly notarized and witnessed. But both witnesses worked for a law firm Christopher had hired earlier that year. The will had been changed in important ways. Nearly $2 million, 0 cents in charitable donations were taken out, along with a note saying that those promises had already been kept. Christopher's inheritance had also grown significantly, and new clauses gave him much more control over his father's intellectual property, such as books and movies. The trust funds for the grandchildren still existed, but the terms were loosened, making it easier to keep an eye on things. But the most upsetting change was subtle but important. The original will had a clause that said no one could change the document if Gene's mental health got worse. That clause had been taken out. It was a carefully worded safety measure meant to stop any manipulation if Gene got worse. The fact that it was missing raised serious legal questions. There were moral and legal questions, like did Gene really mean to change his will so drastically, or had someone taken advantage of his weakness in his last year? These questions became central to the debate when the case went to trial. Was Christopher just doing what his father wanted, or was there something much more sinister going on? The truth stayed hidden under layers of legal arguments, medical reports, and conflicting testimony, and as the courtroom battle went on, everyone watched to see if justice was done, would be served, or if yet another family's legacy would be tainted by doubt and controversy. Christopher argued that the changes to the will were exactly what his father wanted. He told the court that Gene had made these choices on his own, saying that his father had grown suspicious of some charitable groups and was worried about what would happen to his life's work after he died. He wanted things to be clear and simple, but the people who were prosecuting the case didn't believe him. Christopher was thought to have taken advantage of Gene when he was most vulnerable. The will wasn't illegal, it had been signed and approved by the right people. Everything looked good on paper, but the real problem wasn't with the documents, it was with the timing, the people involved, and Gene's health when he made these decisions. His medical records told a complicated story. Some doctors said he seemed confused or had trouble remembering things, while others said he had aid. A few weeks before he died, a test showed that Gene's memory wasn't perfect, but it also showed that he wasn't completely unable to remember anything. This uncertainty made the case even harder. The prosecutor's main points were access, contradictions, and motivation. First, they said that Christopher had taken charge of almost every part of his father's life in his last year. He planned Gann's appointments, decided who could see him, and handled all of his legal matters. Second, they showed that Christopher's stories about his father's health didn't match up with what doctors were hearing. He said Gene was getting worse quickly, but at the same time, he talked to his father about book projects and home improvements. Finally, they gave a strong reason why Christopher might have done all of this. He wanted more money and power, especially since he had been fighting with other family members for a long time. This was one of the strongest pieces of evidence, came in the form of an audio recording. A close family friend had recorded a conversation with Gene a few months before he died. On the recording, Gene was heard talking about his will, He said that he had written it years ago and didn't want to change it. Just as Gene was finishing his thought, Christopher cut him off and told the friend to stop recording. The defense said that the recording wasn't legally important because it was just casual conversation, but the prosecutor saw it as more important because it showed what Gene really wanted. There was a difference between what Gene thought happened and what actually happened. Perhaps the most surprising witness wasn't someone from the outside. It was one of the lawyers who had signed the will. When asked, she admitted that while Gene seemed aware when signing, she hadn't been told that he had Alzheimer's. When asked if she would have handled things differently if she had known, she hesitated before answering. During most of the trial, he sat with his hands crossed and his face tight with emotion. He barely looked up except to read emails or documents. He never spoke up or protested, but the tension in the room rose every time a message or recording of his voice played in the courtroom. One of the tense moments happened when an old text message from Christopher was read out loud. The message was sent just days after the will was changed, and the defense said that Christopher was only talking about finishing up. The prosecutors said that the way it was written didn't sound like a simple update. It sounded like someone who had successfully cleared the last hurdle in their way. This trial wasn't just about money, it was also about family, trust, and what it meant to respect someone's last wishes. As each part of the will was looked at, there didn't seem to be a single clear act of wrongdoing, but rather a pattern of small, careful decisions. Outside of court, the case caused heated debates. Some people thought it should have stayed private and never been made public, while others thought it was an important case that showed how elderly people are sometimes forced to change their wills. News outlets asked experts to talk about the morality of estate planning, and talk shows looked into how common it was for family members to change the wills of their elderly relatives. One famous reporter even called the case heartbreaking. But inside the courtroom, things felt much more personal. It wasn't just about the law. This case was about whether Gene's last wishes had been legally carried out, or if someone else had changed his legacy. After weeks of careful study, every word in the will, every signature, every date, and every change had been broken down and studied. The court wasn't there to decide who was a good son or a bad son, or to judge love or loyalty. Their job was just to find out if the will had been changed legally and without any pressure. The world was left to decide if Christopher had broken his father's trust on the last day of arguments. The courthouse was packed. Santa Fe had never seen anything like it. Reporters lined the sidewalks and true crime podcasters whispered into their microphones. Fans of Gann held up old movie posters as if he might somehow come back. What had begun as a private legal battle had turned into a national spectacle. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable, with reporters, lawyers, witnesses, and family members in every seat. As journalists whispered and photographers adjusted their cameras, but everything changed when Christopher walked into the room wearing a dark suit. He didn't look like the towering figure the media had portrayed. He looked smaller than the media had made him out to be. His face was tired and his expressions were hard to read because he mostly avoided eye contact with the audience and walked straight to his seat. He was no longer the man who had confidently given interviews. He was now the man under the world's microscope. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe, and click the next movie that comes up.